Hey everyone, welcome to this amazing panel for Aromanticism in YA. I'm so excited to be hosting this. It's so great. I know that it's not Arrow Week anymore, but I'm still really excited to chat. Just a brief a few housekeeping things, and then I'll introduce it and then we'll jump into it. We don't tolerate any harassment of any kind, so if you are engaging in that, then we will kick you off, and that that's just, I guess, something that now we have to say in front of everything. I am Lily, and I'm a book human, I guess, on the internet now, where I review slash talk about books. It used to just be sci-fi, fantasy, but now it's just any book that I manage to read with my brain. And so, yeah, that's basically all you need to know about me. I will let these fantastic authors introduce themselves, and then we will get into some questions that I have. And also, if you have any questions, we'll do like a Q&A at the end, so you can kind of put them in the chat thing, and I'll hopefully remind you if I remember to remind you. All right. So, Akemi, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Akemi Dawn Bowman. I'm the author of books that include Starfish, Summerbird Blue, and more recently the Infinity Court series. And I live in Scotland, so that's why it's kind of dark in here because the light's gone. So
Should I go next? Hi, I'm Emily. I wrote This Golden Flame, and my next book, Self in the Mist, is coming out in November.
Hi, I'm Rebecca McLaughlin. It's not close enough for me to grab it. It's 2 inches away. I'm the author of Nameless Queen, a young adult fantasy about a girl called Coin in search of both her name and the answer to the mystery of magic that she has.
And I'm Rosiee Thor, and I am the author of Tarnished Are the Stars and Fire Becomes Her, both about Arrow and A-Spec people, sci-fi and fantasy.
Fantastic. I'm so excited, as I said, for this panel. And let's just jump into my questions. I have a bunch. I don't think we'll get to them all, but I'm a curious person at this point. So I would like to know, first of all, was there any pushback or reservations about submitting a book with Arrow Rep? And sort of just generally, what was the journey for you to write your respective book?
I'll go first. So for me, the pushback came mostly from like other writers and people within the community telling me that books without romance or books that didn't center like a strong ship of some kind would not be publishable. And so in my process of writing my first book, I really struggled with how to write authentically about Aries people. I also was in the process of figuring out my own identity while I was writing it. And so I didn't really set out to write a book that was Aries, but I did write a book that didn't have any romance to begin with. And I really got a lot of pushback there. So I did end up adding a romance to it. But in later stages of the process of writing, and obviously, I got an agent and an editor. They actually both encouraged me to write more about the Aries side of things for that book. And so I was actually quite encouraged by the people on my team, which was great. And then for Fire Becomes Her, I didn't really experience any pushback as far as like, you can't write an Arrow character or anything like that. Nobody said anything like that to me, but there's a lot of implication about, like, again, books with no romance in them or books that don't center a romantic arc of some kind. And neither of my books have no romance. Neither of my books don't have like a romantic arc of any kind, but it's not the kind that you necessarily expect because we have Aries rep going on. And there was definitely pushback from other writers and in the community saying people won't want to read that, when in fact people do want to read it. And the only people who are pushing back on it are people who are trying to like save me from myself from writing a book that's going to flop. And they're the only ones who think that. So it's kind of a weird the pushback comes from a very weird place, I think, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, I'll hop on after that. So I had almost a similar but inverse experience. So Nameless Queen, as published, does not have any romance in it, but when it sold, it did. And so, like, for the character arc of the story, it's very much one of those like, oh no, I'm hyper emotionally guarded and don't let myself be close to people. And then she had this best friend character who ended up being kind of like the subplot romance, which is, again, very, very common for YA genre. But during the course of revisions, my editor asked if I would cut the character in the story called Hat, in favor of just kind of having one friend character instead of having two. And so I stepped away, among other things, and re-outlined the story and didn't tell anyone as I was doing this. I re-outlined it without the romance, like without that character entirely. I wrote them out of the story. And then I sent it back to my editor and I was like, hey, I finished the re-outline, but also cut the romance. And she's like, oh, that's probably not okay, but I will read it and get back to you. And then, like, boon of all things, like, best outcome ever, like, her first line in her email response after getting through the outline was like, hey, you were right, we don't need that character, we don't need that romance, we're going to focus on this other relationship, like that mentee mentor relationship, which fit the character's arc much more nicely, which is why I fought for it. So I feel like I did get away with it, but I do think, like, maybe downstream, like, it did kind of have some impact on how they, like, marketed and pitched the book, because it didn't have that kind of central element that is often so key to pitching.
Yeah, I kind of had the same journey as Rosie, except I had unfortunately like internalized a lot of that. Like even in my own writing, I just felt like I had to write a romance, or else it wouldn't be like an acceptable YA book, I guess. I didn't write a main romance in my first one, but I felt I really needed like at least a secondary romance just so I could say there was like that element in the book. But then, yeah, I actually had very supportive people around me and my team was very supportive. So, yeah, for the next one, I didn't have any romance at all. So I feel like I've been lucky and just I've had that support. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I felt like I had like a really supportive editor the whole way through. I think the book from the start, like it was always going to be the way that it turned out. And yeah, my editor was just really great, was sort of happy for me to tell the story I wanted to tell. And I think because in Summer Bird Blue, Rumi is sort of going through this journey of questioning her identity essentially, and she is kind of figuring it out and talking about these things. I think that may have helped because it was sort of, you know, a reader could come into it as like a way of, I guess, like following along her understanding and her kind of questioning of it. So I don't know if that sort of helped because there wasn't necessarily something to push back on. I don't know, in the same way that maybe other books might unfortunately have that. But yeah, I don't think so. I do think maybe with marketing, I feel like when it came to marketing, maybe they didn't know. I think for me that was the bigger thing, was like I don't know if they fully knew how to market as something because it didn't have the romance. Like it's a story about grief, and her, you know, the friend that she's bonding with is in his 80s. He's the next door neighbor and he's super grouchy, and it was like a weird sort of place to sell that to people, I guess. And strangely, like Summer Bird Blue came out, I think, like 3 years ago now, and I feel like this year it's found more readers now because they've clocked on to the fact that it has, you know, Arrow Ace questioning a storyline in it, and I think that wasn't marketed that way, so nobody really knew about it. I think they're finding out like much later, which is nice that it's finding readers now. But I think that was sort of, I guess, the pushback, if you could call it a pushback, was the marketing side.
Yeah, that so perfectly leads into something that I was thinking about as well, like especially as you know, Emily and Rosie and all of you really have been chatting about like this push for books always to have like a central romance, even if it's like honestly whatever genre it is, right? Like sci-fi, you know, the universe is ending, but they also have to fall in love while the universe is ending, and that's entirely crucial to it being like sellable, right? And so that is a genuine question that I had, was like when kind of what Kemi was talking about, which is why it's a perfect segue. This marketing publicity kind of push in a world, I think, that has this kind of like, how do I describe it? It's not like heteronormativity. Is it like romance normativity? I don't like.
We call it allonormativity
Yes,
or amononormativity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, like marketing, the challenges, or not even the challenges, but like the kind of what I was saying before, this, the marketing / publicity for your book, and like whether, kind of finds readers and like how it is marketed slash publicized, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think there's still a bit of a gap there. Like if you do look at the romance genre, like you have all these things with like tropes, and like if you say, you know, the enemies to lover trope, then all of a sudden like you know who your audience is and you can attract people to your books with that just by saying it's an enemy to lover story. And I feel like marketing hasn't developed that for like family driven stories or like friendships driven stories. It's harder to kind of condense it, I guess, to that bite size, like juicy bit that's going to attract people to your books. So yeah, I'm not quite sure like the industry as a whole really knows how to like market like stories just that are family centered or friendship centered as well as they can do romance right now. I also feel like sometimes a book without a romance, like some people just assume it's for children or that it's for a younger age group because it doesn't have that romance, which is of course not true, but I have noticed that sometimes that they kind of like downgrade, I guess, its age just because it doesn't have that romance.
I was trying to unmute myself and had some trouble there. Sorry. I totally agree. I think that marketing as a whole, especially with online marketing, relies really, really heavily on trope-driven messaging. There's this like very, very strange reliance on ship dynamics and romance tropes as like the only way to market a book. And so those like little bullet point lists of like what's in the book, or there's those little graphics of the book with like arrows pointing to them. They're always about the romantic tropes and what's going on in the book. And I think it's because of the very large and vocal romance community, which is a great thing to have. I mean, you know, that's a really amazing community that exists, but they are often centered in spaces where maybe maybe it isn't the right space for them. So like, you know, for example, we see a lot of like, you know, on TikTok, there's a lot of like spicy TikTok, and that's not really what we're doing in YA. And so, you know, it's not always the space for it, but it is a very loud and very effective marketing technique. And so I think that YA marketing on the whole has kind of adopted it, which works for some books, but because now people are so used to seeing books marketed in that way, we don't see books like ours being marketed in a way that's meeting the marketing expectations of those readers. They're confused by the marketing sometimes, I think. And that's on us, you know, that's on us and the publishing industry, not on the readers who are confused. We definitely need to figure out a better way to communicate our stories and you know, really just share that in a way that's going to resonate with people.
Right. And I think too, it's important to pay attention to the fact that like marketing is not, and it's ironic to say this, but it's not really a driving force in like the scope of books that make their way to readers or that become popularized. Like when you go to market something, you don't say, hey, what do we think is going to market well? Like we look at what has been marketed successfully. And that's where, you know, because if you're going to put money into something, you want to have a track record of some kind. And so breaking into this and a lot of other diverse spaces, you sort of need something in that breakout space to prove that it can be done before they start seeing more industry-wide support for it.
On that note, I am really excited to see marketing wise. This is maybe a little bit of a meta thing that I'm going to say, but I am really excited to see marketing wise what happens in the wake of Loveless hitting the New York Times bestseller list, which just happened like a week ago. And it's like the first big Arrow book to ever hit the list, and it's huge. So I'm really interested to see how that impacts marketing going forward for other contemporary Arrow stories, and see. I'm really hoping that it just really opens the doors and creates more space for stories like that to be marketed in a big way. So that was cool. And on that note, Rebecca, I think that's exactly what you're like, exactly the right thing, is that if we don't see books succeeding, then we don't have something to point to then replicate the marketing for. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Well, and I'll just add too, like, I think also when we look at it from kind of that intersectional space, like, you know, not just focusing in on like the market, by Arrow for Arrow or by Ace for Ace, or like, by minority for minority, like especially when it's with women-led stories where it has like a central main character that's woman or feminine presenting. It's historically like hard to separate out having women-led stories that don't have romance. So like you see a lot of stories that have men in them that don't have romance, but it's not necessarily like in the Arrow space, but it is a much more common thing to see in that arena as well. So I think that as we start to see more stories succeed both with direct representation and then also just stories in media succeed that don't focus on stories with women plus romance, that's a great direction overall and larger to hit too.
Yeah, I think that's so insightful too, because I think if you look at any other, movies or TV shows, like you see the same kind of thing that you're talking about, right? I think, it reminds me of that like test there is, but I can't remember the name because I can't remember any words really at this current moment. But that test about like characters you're talking, and if they only talk about like their relationship. And I think they specifically mean romantic relationship too, not like any relationship.
Bechdel test, I think, is the one.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. I was like, is it bechamel? No, it's not bechamel. Is it like what? It starts with a B and it sounds kind of like bechamel, but not really the same. But I think the Loveless one is a great example. And I think that I wanted to know if you remember the first Arrow book you read, good or bad, or even just like Arrow piece of, media, because I do think that we see either like, I feel like I stumble either upon books that have Arrow rep in it, which I had no idea about, or I find books specifically because, and I felt like it's kind of hard sometimes to be in that middle space. But yeah, if you remember the first Arrow book / media thing that you were exposed to.
I am trying to remember if it was the first or if it was just like the most impactful. And I think it must have been the most impactful. I'm sure I came across some other stuff before it. But it's an indie book. It's The Ice Princess's Fair Illusion by Dove Cooper. And it's a written in verse, and it's very interesting. It was the first thing that I had ever read like it, and I don't think I've ever read anything like it since. It's so cool and very odd, and I liked it so much. But it is about these two princesses who are both on the Ace and Arrow spectrum, and it's very fairy tale-esque. It's I believe, a retelling of Bluebeard. And it's about like a princess who does not want to get married, and she ends up escaping her princessly duties with this other Arrow Ace girl, and they go and like raise sheep, and it's just really lovely. And what I loved about it so much is that it was two people experiencing the same like identity label, but in different ways, and they talk about that, and they have a queer platonic partnership that they talk about in verse. The verse is very cool. It's conversational. They're arguing with each other about their relationship, and it feels very like old married couple, but for queer platonic partnerships, and it was really lovely. I think that was one of the first ones I came across, if not the first that I read.
If that's not a trope, it should be. Queer platonic
Right?
old married couple.
I agree.
I'll jump in just because I have a super short answer, because it took me that long to find a book that was like had it on the page. I think Loveless was the first that like was actually like had the the terms in there that you actually could read. So yeah, that's like my very short answer. I mean, I think the internet argues as to whether Katniss Everdeen is or isn't. So I don't know if that's like a heated debate. So I don't know if that counts, because I don't think it's actually like ever been said for sure. But I know some people like to claim her as on their on their thing. So
I'm some people.
yeah. I feel like the words are there. I feel like the text is there. I know there was like that line about like the needing a good hunting partner or whatever, like not caring about a husband, and I was like, I feel like that fits.
Yeah, if anyone is curious about this, I actually did a close reading of the first book for this specifically as a Twitter thread like 3 years ago. It's hashtag the A-Spec Games. So if you look for it, it's there on Twitter. The thread's still there. It's very long. It has a lot of textual evidence. I basically like academia my way into getting ratioed on Twitter because of it. But I really enjoyed that deep dive. It was really fun. And I agree with you, Akemi. I think it's there. I don't know that it really counts because it's not, it's like subtextual, and the internet very quickly claimed her as like in a shipping war more. And so I feel like there's that element as well, but I totally agree with you. The evidence is there.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
My first one was actually Rosie's Tarnished All the Stars. So thank you. I also feel that Elsa from Frozen is Arrow Ace, so that's my mountain to die on.
I will join you on that mountain. Among my first also was Rosie's Tarnished All the Stars. It's on my stars. It's on my shelf back here. And then also M.K. England's The Disasters. And then I think like branching out to other media. Just like, you know, off the cuff thinking about like strong female driven stories that don't center romance is like Captain Marvel, the latest incarnation and arguably earlier incarnations of like Doctor Who, the Alien Saga, just to name a few.
Yeah, those are all really good, like quality recs as well in general. Yeah, I think the first book I read was Akemi's Summer Bird Blue, and I think that was so. And I read it when it came out too, so like before, you know, the resurgence of people like chatting about the rep too. I think I found it because I loved Starfish, and then it was like a beautiful surprise, I guess, afterwards that I had the like questioning rep, and I was like, whoa, this is so cool. Why has no one told me about this? Let's see. I'm trying to find, because in the questions, I kind of jumped around a little bit. But one thing I wanted to ask, since we're talking about Arrow kind of books and, you know, Arrow media, do you have any other favorite Arrow books you've read or ones that you're looking forward to?
I really love Alaptui. I think Darcy Little Badger. That's an excellent one.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I really love that one. That's so good. I also really love What We Devour by Lindsay Miller. It's super dark. Actually, you know, I think that one might just be Ace now that I'm thinking about it, but it's great anyway. And then as far as books that are coming out soon that I'm excited about, I am really excited for Funeral Girl by, I think it's Emma K. Oland, I think is the name. It comes out this fall and it looks great. And then also The Butterfly Assassin by Finn. Oh gosh, I'm like forgetting names. It's still morning for me. I haven't had any food or caffeine. So I think Finn Longman is the name. Oh, and you know what? Another really good one for just like Arrow Rep, The Last 8 by Laura Pohl, and then also Grimrose Girls by Laura Pohl. Everything Laura Pohl writes. Everybody should be a Laura Pohl stan, is what I'm saying.
Furiously taking notes over here. Outside of the ones already mentioned, I don't know that I have any like things specific that I'm looking up toward. But like just sharing some hot tips for like the way I kind of try to research them, because it is, you kind of find like maybe a short list that's the same. There's the Arrow Ace database, which sounds like it should like have database ACE, but they didn't rhyme it. It's regular database word. And also things like crowdsourcing, because a lot of these things again don't get marketing pushes. So like researching from fan-driven things, so like lists on Goodreads or articles that way, or tags or things like that. And then also like local sellers and librarians. So that's just my pitch for how to find more.
I'll add on to that. The LGBTQ Reads website has a whole list of Arrow and Ace rep, which I should have looked at before this panel, but didn't.
Yeah, I'm very, very behind on my reading list, so I'm just going to like, yeah, take notes on all these and put that on my list to be excited about. So
Yeah, I feel like, wait, I feel when we were talking last, Rosie, we were talking about that book with dogs. The one, oh no, not dogs, horses, animals, animals and sleds.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh, thank you.
What is it called?
Reckless Kind, by Carly
Yeah,
Heath. Yeah, you said dogs, and I was like,
yeah,
no, it
I
is.
was like,
It's like horse racing in like Scandinavian fantasy world. It's great, and it's got a queer platonic partnership between the three main characters. It's an Ara Ace girl, and then her two gay best friends, and they like have this beautiful found family, like kind of queer platonic thing going on. Oh, it's just great. Yeah, that's a really good one as well. And then another one just to add on, because my brain is now has woken up. If It Makes You Happy by Claire Kahn is a really excellent book. Most people know her for her first book, Let's Talk About Love, which is the like very ace book. It's like all ace colors. Everybody knows that one. But her second book was actually really fantastic and centers a girl who's in a queer platonic partnership with an aromantic girl. And it's about the main character experiencing romantic attraction and love for the first time for someone else while being in this queer platonic partnership, and how she balances those relationships. And it's just fantastic. And it's got really, really awesome, really interesting fat rep as well. And so I loved it. And it's a contemporary, it's very cute. It's got a bakery, like, good vibes.
And sorry, what was the name of the Scandinavian one?
The Reckless Kind by Carly Heath.
yeah, that makes sense because I was then while everyone was talking, I was like furiously trying to Google the one that we were chatting about, and I was like, dogs, Iditarod, and it makes sense that obviously didn't, because I always thought, I feel like that's the only thing I can think of about racing, but also sleds, and I'm like, oh, sleds are pulled by dogs, right? But no, sleds are also pulled by horses.
Horses. Yeah.
What I wanted, oh, another question that I wanted to ask, and oh, by the way, as well, if anyone else has questions, they should start to drop them there, in case anyone also has things that they'd like to know. Something that I wanted to know as well was if there'd been a challenge with your respectives' books, either in general or specifically with the rep, and what has kind of been a joy, maybe a discovery, a joy, like an unexpected happy coincidence, I guess, with your respective books.
oh, do you want to go? You go ahead. Sure. Okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think for like the joy part, it was just being able to explore that sort of questioning, gray, demi, as like all the different sort of labels that there are and where you can fit in. That was really nice because when I was growing up, I guess I just never thought that there were options like that. I didn't grow up in an environment with, like people who were like, oh yeah, you have more than this one option. And so like it just never occurred to me that like, I don't know, you could have a label that fit you or explore different labels and try to figure out what fit. So I think that was just really nice for me to be able to kind of like write that. It felt like very therapeutic, I guess, to kind of go through like all the thoughts that I had like when I was younger and put it into a book and kind of explore that. So yeah, I think I'm using my books as therapy, but it feels good for me. So yeah.
I'm totally with you on that. I'm using my books as therapy too. The weird thing for me is that I feel like as I write books, I always find out something new about myself as I'm writing them. And so like with Tarnished Are the Stars, I was discovering my own identity as I was writing it. I didn't know that I was Ara Ace when I started writing it. I just kind of like stumbled my way through it. And then as I joined writing communities, I found labels that people were talking about for other books. And I was like, oh, that's neat. That sounds like me. And so like learning about it through writing the characters was really interesting and very joyful for me, but also very challenging because you're in that like questioning phase for yourself and you're struggling through the balance of like wanting to write something that's authentic to what you're going through and what you have experienced in the past, but also not wanting to, like, at the time, you know, when I was writing it, own voices was a really big deal. And I was very, very hesitant about wanting to write something that maybe wasn't my identity. Like, I didn't know yet because I was questioning. And so that was a big struggle for me. But by the time, obviously, it was published, I had figured out my labels. And the same thing happened for Fire Becomes Her with a side character who is non-binary. And I was like putting all these words in their conversation that I was like, wow, this is really relatable to me. How weird. And, like, you know, learning that, oh, wait, I actually identify this way as well. And I feel like as I write, I'm always like the Spider-Man meme, you know, like pointing, you know, at each other being like, oh, it's me. But like I write the rep and then I'm like, oh, whoops, that was me. But that's really cool. And kind of like it is very much a joyful thing for me to write something like that then resonates with me. And I'm like, I'm my first reader. And so, you know, if it resonates with me, hopefully it'll resonate with somebody else too. But it's very cool to have that experience as both the writer and then as the first reader of the book and be like, oh, this is feeling like it's important to me. How cool. Especially when it's something that I didn't expect to, when it was like a side character that I wasn't intentionally pasting my own identity onto.
Rosie, same. When I was writing Nameless Queen, I did not yet have the labels, or I did not know they existed, which was part of the reason I did not know to have them. And so all I knew at the time, like writing this story, was like what came naturally to me when I would write and what didn't come naturally. So like layering in this romance, like I knew and had that voice in my head, and not just from outside, but also internal of like, hey, gotta have this subplot romance. It's in there. It sure is in there. But it wasn't like necessarily ever this thing that like felt like I was exploring something by putting it in there. It's like I'm checking a box kind of. Not that I, you know, can't write it to the intended experience of that character. But I think so, like throughout the process, like when we got to that part where I was proposing to remove the romance, I was like, yeah, this isn't the best choice for my character's arc. I don't want this in here. And they were like, but the marketing. And I was like, but the story, the character. And so like, you know, moving forward through time, like the book's coming out at some point, like I'm done working on it and I'm like, oh, there's labels out there. There's aromanticism, there's asexuality. I didn't know what these were, but boy, am I them. So it's kind of that same experience of writing and like kind of understanding the periphery of my own identity and exploring those things through writing, both by what comes easy and like what draws my interest and like what I resonate with like inside of those characters themselves.
I'm seeing some people in the comments just like feeling very inspired and resonate. They're feeling very resonated, or that resonates with them a lot. And so if it does for you, you should check out Rebecca's TikTok. She has an amazing series. I think it's called like How I Should Have Known That I Was Aro Ace. And it's like hilarious. Every time one of them pops up on my For You page, I just crack up and it's so relatable. So everyone should check those out.
That's so sweet. The funny thing about that was that the series started with how I should have known I was asexual. And at some point, via other people's comments and explanations of identities, I also realized that what I thought was part of this Venn diagram circle of asexuality was actually part of this Venn diagram of this circle in the Venn diagram of aromanticism. So it's like kind of like center of the circle syndrome, where like you say, oh, these things are true about me. Here's a label. Like what parts of my identity does that cover? And we're not necessarily great at parsing those out until we hear from other people or until we have like definitions and labels to cling on to. And I think that's like one of the great things that both like communities and book communities and stories can help us do.
Yeah, for me, this Golden Flame is my debut, and the main character, Karis, is like heavily influenced by my own identity. So one of the biggest challenges was actually like putting something so personal on the page and knowing that like many people are going to read it. It was challenging in like a very good way and like a very joyful way. And I think the most joyful thing was just being able to kind of have that centered friendship, and then just make that friendship, you know, as important as any other relationship. Because even as a woman, like I know when I was like growing up, it was kind of understood that like my romantic partner would be the most important relationship I would ever have. And then by the time I got old enough to say, no, that's not like the way I feel, it was still kind of understood that like if I don't have a romantic partner, somehow, as a woman, I'm not, complete or whatever. So I love just being able to, kind of make that friendship as important as anything else.
And then my last question before we transition over is that it's kind of what we were talking about as well, like queer journeys and questioning rep specifically in books. And so I wanted to know, then since we have a variety of different characters at different stages of like, figuring things out and kind of figuring like labels out and, what kind of things fit for them. Can you talk about how your character related or navigated their queer questioning or identity in your books?
Yeah, so I think that in both my books, it's very much a questioning journey and figuring out kind of how they're identifying. And I think that the way that I ended up approaching that for Fire Becomes Her was very similar to my own journey. I was very much in a allonormative space that was very, it was actually not just allonormative, it was like compulsory allo. Like it was so specifically, and also compulsory heteronormative. It was a competitive dancing, partner dancing. And so there's this very like gendered, there's a boy and a girl and they dance together. And there's like a very romantic-y, sexy vibe. I don't know why my voice did that. I'm so sorry, everyone. But like that was the vibe of every performance. It was competitive. And so I would often encounter things like judges would tell me that they like didn't understand the story if I was like dancing with another girl or something like that. And they just didn't get that like two people could dance together and have it not be a sexy thing. Like it's an art form. It's this other type of expression. It doesn't have to all be about sex and romance. And I definitely took that experience and kind of put it into a fantasy world of this person who is feeling the expectation around them and this very strong sense of this is what other people want me to do, so I have to do it. And through meeting other people who are more open to letting people be who they are and less concerned about what other people think, is able to start exploring her own identity and actually start to process, the ways that pressure has created trauma and start to kind of undo that and choose for herself what she wants. So it very much is a copy and paste of my own kind of just experience with the allonormative world and the way that pressure can impact you and make you do things and choose things that you would not otherwise do, just kind of for the benefit of other people who actually in the end don't matter.
Yeah, for me, I really wanted to make a queer normative world because, I made a fantasy world. It was roughly based on ancient Greece, but I do feel like ancient Greece was pretty queer anyways. And yeah, just because I had that kind of freedom to play with it, I did just want to make a world where like everyone was accepted exactly who they are. So yeah, I don't have too much questioning identities just because it is so queer normative and it's all accepted, which was very lovely to write.
Yeah, I feel very much the same way too. I know that like in Nameless Queen, one of the things I was very intentional about was having it be kind of that queer normative space, which even in its smallest measures can make a very large impact on readers. Because obviously like romance was not a part of my story, romantic relationships weren't. But there's this scene where the main character saves two husbands from a fire, and it's just not completely, but it's like glossed over as like this is normal. And it's a very, very short scene, but it's one of the things I've gotten comments from readers on the most, saying, hey, I like how normal you made this. Because I think that especially, as diverse stories are brought more to the spotlight, they tend to initially focus more on, the coming out story or being outed or stories that center on like trauma or pain in that space. And I think one of the great things that fantasy stories can do or fiction in general, is it can normalize those things and make them a normal part of the world, even if that's like not quite where we're at in all spaces in the real world just yet too.
Yeah, for me in Summerbird Blue, so Rumi is questioning a lot. The book is about her losing her sister, so it's very heavy about grief. And one of the things though is that Rumi feels like her sister was the only one she could talk to about how she felt when it came to, you know, her identity. And so now that her sister's gone, she kind of has this like panic of feeling like very, you know, misunderstood and doesn't really know how to talk to anybody about it. And ultimately she'll meet friends that that kind of normalize it for her and like almost give her permission, like saying like, you know, it's okay to be questioning. It's also okay to use whatever label feels right for you at that time. And it's okay to change your mind. And just have that be like that reassurance. And I guess for me, it's a part of it was because I think it can be really lonely if you don't have a family, like a support system or whatever that you can talk about stuff with or kind of explore your identity with. I think it's really hard. So I think I was trying to sort of like navigate that through Rumi's thoughts of, you know, she's grieving and she's angry, but also have that be something of how much people can really need that support system and people to kind of just say, you know, it's okay to be wondering, it's okay to, you know, have these labels at all, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, so I think for Rumi, definitely it was like a journey. So that's kind of how I saw it, as like sort of exploring that.
Yeah, I think that is all of the as Rosie was saying as well. I think that the panel is just so kind of inspiring and heartwarming, as someone has said earlier as well, and also just like so lovely to chat about, because I kind of what Rebecca was saying, right? I do feel like it's hard to find stories that don't center on, like, as we were talking about earlier, right? Either it's like a queer, very much like this is a queer story in marketing, or this is like a story about something else, but there are queer characters, dot dot dot. And so I feel like it's so lovely that all of these books like are bridging this gap, that are like stories about people, obviously stories about people, but also like stories about, you know, other fantasy queer normative worlds, or about like the difficulty of sort of navigating your identity. And specifically, yeah, what you were saying, Akemi, was like, you know, losing someone who is like not your sounding board, because that sounds like a little bit like one-sided, but you know, that those relationships that make you feel seen. And I think that like so much of, I guess, part of our panel is about being seen. So I'm gonna switch over to one of our questions from the chat, which was asking, who are your favorite authors? I don't know if this is necessarily like targeted towards like certain, you know, towards this like Arrow authors, but in general, I guess, who are your favorite authors of all time?
My favorite authors are Tamara Pierce and Victoria Rosiee and Leigh Bardugo. And I loved it when I think Tamara Pierce said Alana was possibly queer, like after all those years. Like, I'm not sure if you've ever read the Song of the Lioness Quartet, but she said like back then she didn't necessarily have the language, but like Alana was possibly queer, and that just meant so much to me because, you know, she was one of the characters I loved so much when I was little.
I can't believe I didn't think of this until just now, but you're absolutely right, Emily. Tamara Pierce is one of my favorite authors as well, and actually her book series on Kel, I can't remember the name of that quartet, but Kel is actually your ace, yeah. And so I guess Arrow, maybe not Ace, I can't remember, but she's definitely on the Arrow and Ace spectrum. And I totally forgot about it when you mentioned the first book that you ever encountered with that, and she would have been it. But I love Tamara Pierce so much. Huge fan of hers. I also really love Lindsay Miller, who writes really amazing queer fantasy, specifically with ace characters, very commonly.
I think for me, it's almost always what I'm reading currently, and I just started reading The City of Brass finally after a million years. So I'm definitely in love with that book at the moment. But I also a big fan of Victoria Rosiee and Leigh Bardugo, and that is all I can think of right now because my mind is just like glazing over with so many things.
Yeah, I'm echoing Leigh Bardugo. She's one of my favorites for sure. I really love Samantha Shannon as well. The Priory of the Orange Tree is one of my favorite books of all time. Yeah, so I feel like I'm like losing all. I feel like it's more books that I remember. Like I don't know. It depends like what I'm reading at the time. I think like yeah, it sort of switches. Like I have new favorites all the time. Then I'm like jumping around. So I don't know. My brain's kind of chaotic.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you bring up Tamara Pierce too, because I also grew up like reading every single Tamara Pierce book, basically till I don't even remember. But basically all of them. Like, I think that I think my favorite has to be Dane, just because I mean, as a true fantasy lover, like the idea of speaking to fantasy animals, like mind speaking, is just you can't pass it up, really.
If
But I also
anyone read her other series, the Circle of Magic ones, they're not as popular as her Tortal ones, but the Circle of Magic ones, Sandry in those is Ace, and it's in I think it's on the page in the later books, so that's very very cool. And I didn't know that when I read it originally because it doesn't come in until like I think the third series or something like that. But yeah, it's there. We've got the rep.
now you're making me really like want to reread the entire like circle mat like stepping stones, I think, and like
Yeah.
the circle breaks and like it's reforged. Yeah, because there's multiple
I
series.
just want to reread them all. I want to do like a little book club reread.
Oh my god, Rosie, I would totally.
Do you want to buddy read them with me?
I would 100%. They would be
Okay,
so,
do it.
so calm to my soul right now. Yeah, because I love I was also thinking about the circle of magic too. Like I love also how all of their powers and the friendship, like the core friendship group in that is so beautiful. I don't know. I think I'm getting like very emotional thinking about it because when
Anyone
I read
needs to replace a certain magic school book series in their heart. This is a really good magic school book series to use.
Yeah, and I also think that the last thing I will say, because I won't like keep talking about this, but I think the last thing I will say also to that note is like there's also more about like how to do magic. Like it's an actual you are taught to do magic and not just like it's a it's a story where you're learning, but like you're also doing all these other 5 million things. Like these people come here to learn. Like they're gonna learn how to do their magic.
So good. They're so good.
But what you were also saying, like the Claire Con as well, I think like both If It Makes You Happy and Let's Talk About Love, I think are both like very standout recommendations in my mind. I think Let's Talk About Love is like the first, obviously, I guess before the Circle of Magic, like the first Ace rep I think I ever read, like ever. And I mean, if you think about like that's relatively recent, right, in the span of history that these books have been existing. Maybe not the Tamara Pierce ones; those are a little bit older. But yeah, I think I think other people would also be interested in reading along with us. So some other questions we have. Sorry, I'm just reading them as I say it. What is your advice for an author looking to write main arrow rep in their story?
I'd say just like stay true to yourself and stay true to your character's story. Don't let other people convince you that you're somehow doing it wrong or that like they need to have that romance or they need to have those relationships. Just make sure you're being honest about like who you are and who you think the character is. And you're awesome.
I totally agree. I think for me, like when I was first starting to write these things, I felt very pressured to include romance, very pressured to change the story that I was telling and change the characters to be more palatable to a larger audience. But as you know, we've talked about a little bit, there's no guarantee of that larger audience anyway. So you may as well write to your intended audience and just know that that book will find its people. Yeah, it's not always better to appeal to a wider audience. It's sometimes better to be the book that, you know, just a few people really need because oftentimes they don't have a lot to hold on to. So being able to provide that for a smaller niche group is just as, I think, important and impactful.
Yeah, to second that, I think the stories that you write that are closer to your heart are always going to be better and resonate than stories that are written with like whispering voices, from the outside controlling too much. And there is that concern about like, palatability, marketability. Those voices will come. Those voices will happen when that stage happens of the process. And if at that point, like it makes sense and for the story and for whatever reasons to make those changes, you can. But as much as you can listen to your own self and your own instincts and the stories that you want to tell, the better.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said. And I think when you're writing the book that you need, it's going to resonate with somebody else who needs it too. If you try to write a book that you think that everybody's going to need, and it's impossible to do that. You can't write a book that's going to please everybody and check all these boxes for every single person in the world. So I mean, the best thing you can really do is write the book that you want to read most. And I think that kind of honesty comes through. Yeah, and don't worry about marketing because I feel like it changes all the time and not all of it's true. So
Yeah, I love what you said earlier, Rosie. Like, you're the first reader of your story. I thought that was like super wise. I think that it's a strategy I've been employing a lot with my own TikToks, where it's like, I'm the first one who watches this. And if I find it funny, I'll post it. Maybe only 10 other people will find it funny and watch it. But like, as long as I can continue watching it 10 times to add captions to it, like I better like it. Otherwise, like I shouldn't post it if I can't sit through listening to my own voice and watching my cringy acting like 10 times. It's not going to make it to the internet. Another question we had is, what are your thoughts on fanfic/fan works? I mean, and this may be because we were talking a lot about like Katniss Everdeen and like other things. So I think that probably is what I thought of first when I saw this question.
I'm a big fan. Pro fanfic, pro fan works, pro fan art. Make the stuff that makes you happy. I know for me and for a lot of other authors, having like fan art or fan fiction written about our works is like a big bucket list item. So like I say go for it. Like you're gonna make somebody's day. And also it's a really great way to like engage with other people who love the thing that you love. I definitely started out in fanfic when I was a teenager writing. I actually wrote a very, very long fan fiction about a Tamara Pierce book. It does not exist on the internet. I lost the notebook it was in, so it did not get posted. But it's a really great way to just, I think, have a conversation with yourself and with the work, and that's really fun. But it can also be a really great way to connect with other people who are enjoying the types of media that you're enjoying, even if that feels like it's a really small, tiny little circle. Probably on the internet, it's a much bigger circle than you think.
yeah, I agree with that. And I think I think there's something like really cool about like you write a book and then somebody else loves it that much that they want to give it more life. I think that's like one of the highest compliments that you could really get. So yeah, definitely pro fan fiction as well.
Yeah, I love fan fiction and yeah, fan art as well. Some of my closest writing friends are also fan fiction writers, and I'm always like amazed at what they can do with like a story. So yes, go fan fiction.
I am also pro fan fiction, like everyone else. I think from like a writing perspective, it is a completely valid way to sharpen your craft and to create things. And I think it especially gives you like an inlet into those worlds that you find interesting, and it gives you those places to kind of build your craft. So it's like from a writing perspective, totally valid. And then also, I think especially when you layer on top of that fan fiction is oftentimes a place where it's like a more safe exploration, like where people can like layer their own identities and representation into stories that maybe didn't have it as strongly. And so it can often be a safer space or like a more inclusive space for that type of content, because again, it wasn't made like with this narrow marketing focus out for the world. It's people telling the stories that they want to tell at its core.
Yeah, I love the idea of like, if your fan artwork is like another person's bucket list thing. I think that is so cool.
I'll
It
also add, big bucket list item is people cosplaying from your books. That's been so cool. That one's happened to me for both books, but I haven't gotten any fan fiction. So, but the people cosplaying as characters from your books is like the coolest thing that's ever happened to me.
Yeah, I think it's talking about writing stories you want to, like, bringing the characters to life and like writing and honing your craft and all of that. I think that's so important. And I think it's funny because, like, well, not funny, I guess, but like, I think it's very true that you're gonna find an audience for it, and especially with these. And like, I would read a lot of fanfic about this kind of stuff. I recently started like dabbling in reading like Bob's Burger fanfic because I was like, it really bothers me. I was like, are these characters ever going to get older? I know it's a cartoon, but like, I really want to see teenage, like older teenage Louise, or like, I just want to see it. Like, it would make me so happy. And I was like, there has to be something. And then like, I find an AO3 like 500 stories about like, um, you know, aging parents. And I don't know, I have a lot to do, so maybe like after that then I'll read other fanfic, but I'm like heavy right now in the Bob's Burger fanfic world. I think the final question we'll ask, which I think is a really good like wrap-up question as well, is that even though we are late to Arrow Week, I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on like the state of Arrow rep / Arrow awareness in the book world, especially since a common theme that we've been chatting about as well is like, we know semi recently published books chatting about it and being more open about it, and like marketing, being there or not there. Like, I'm really interested in knowing kind of, yeah, what your thoughts are, especially even though Arrow Week is done. But yeah.
I think it's definitely getting better. Like, I think even like, 5 years ago, like there were barely any stories out there, but I do also think there is quite a ways to go. But even just the fact that like we're on this panel right now, I think that's a really good sign, and the times are moving forward. So
I have a lot of opinions about this, so stop me if I start to go a little bit too far. But I agree that we are definitely making progress, but we still have a long ways to go. And a few of the like the big things that I would really like to see happen is more stuff like this, where we're separating out aromanticism from asexuality. That it's not an aro ace panel; this is an aromantic panel. And a lot of the time the two labels get lumped together. And a lot of the time they coexist, like they coexist within me and they coexist within several of my characters, but they don't always coexist. And so I would really like to see more aromantic stories that maybe aren't also asexual, or aro stories that talk about queer platonic partnerships. I'd love to see more elder aro people, like we said, the old married couple that's the queer platonic. I'd love to see more of that. And I'd love to see more aromantic rep that just is intersectional across the board. I'd love to see just more of it existing. I think that a lot of what exists is aromantic, but it's able-bodied, it's white. It's very much it does not have all of those intersections across the board. And I would really like to see more of that, more diversity within aromantic rep. So hopefully we'll see more. There's definitely some that exists, but I want more to exist everywhere, and I want it to be more in all the different exciting ways that it can manifest in different people. So
Yeah, I think the same here, 100%. I think we're all kind of giving that same answer of like, it's improving, like it's getting better. There's definitely a ways to go. I know I mentioned earlier, like I didn't know a lot about myself until like mid to late 20s, because I had not stumbled across the terminology or any stories like that when I was a teenager. They just didn't exist, or if they did, I didn't find them. And so I think it's important to like both that we're seeing like broadening representation, and not always in like the implicit space, but also being explicit with those things, so that people get that terminology, they can do those Googles, figure those things out. And then also, like Rosie mentioned, it's so important to make sure that like, because I think when pieces of diversity like make their way into the mainstream, it's always as adjacent as possible to like cis het whiteness, which is not doing justice or goodness to like the huge broad community of humans out there. So I'm just excited for us to move farther and farther away from that and to get more intersectional stories as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo everything that was said. I think that's all super important. I feel too like because the terminology wasn't maybe as accessible to people, you know, whatever odd years ago. So I think that that's probably part of why maybe like more stories are coming out now that have it in it, is because now people are being like, oh yeah, that's the label that I needed when I was younger and I didn't know that it was there. I guess my biggest thing is that I just hope that books get pushed more. That's kind of always my thing, is that you want the marketing to go with the book, because, you know, there are authors who are writing these stories and they're not necessarily getting the push from the publishers. And that's tough because then it's hard to find its audience. And, you know, then you end up with a thing where people don't like me can sit here and be like, I'm not really sure how many books that I know with these characters, because it's just not readily, like, I feel like you have to deep dive sometimes to find books who are Arrow and Ace and that's tough. And I feel like that's a roadblock for so many people. And I wish it was more easily able for people to find it, because that's what you want. You want these books to get the love that they deserve. So
yeah, like the Google search that happens once you like read a book where you're like, I think that this feels very much like this could be what I think it is, but is it? So I'm gonna like Google and spend an hour just like reading obscure kind of Twitter threads about if this really is what I think it is. I definitely, yeah, I think I echo all of what you're saying, and I feel like the kidlit space is doing. I feel like I was drawn always to the kidlit space specifically for like conversations that we have about like, you know, marginalized identities and also seen representation of all forms in books. And I feel like when I wrote this question, I was thinking about like, how would I answer this question? And I feel like I would love to see more in the, I don't know, is new adult or like older, like, like, I don't know, like 19/20/21, like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of age, you know, people who are probably just now, as you're saying, you know, like discovering labels and questioning their identity, like those stories. Cause I feel like I'm so happy about the representation in the kidlit community. And that's why like, I'm so happy in general, but I really also am looking for like adult stories like that. And like, you know, as we were saying earlier in the panel, you know, not necessarily like, you know, centered around like grief or pain, like in relation to like a queer identity, and like having just more, I guess, is that what we're all talking about, right? Just like more of it, so that there's just so much more to choose from. So thank you all so much for doing this panel and having it. I also really love, as you were saying, Rosie, like that this is for aromanticism in YA, and that like Arrow has like its own thing. I'm really excited. Please also, I think that in the description, if I've done my job right, there should be links for everyone's books. So please make sure to read them / add them to your TBR and support these amazing authors. I know that I will have to do like a TikTok dive after we finish this panel to see Rebecca's TikToks. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And also thank you to our amazing chat and all of the chats that we had, basically just like all heart eye emojis like the entire time. So I hope everyone has a really great day, evening, morning, afternoon thing that they are living in. And we will, yeah, I love the idea of the book club. So we'll get back to you all on that one. Yeah, and thank you all for tuning in. Bye.